for what the center brings, must obviously be that which remains to the end, and was there from eternity. Goethe, Westöstlicher Divan. Where do we come from? That is the first question, and perhaps also the last. What we know as the creation myths of various cultures have tried to answer this question with different symbols. And one of these symbols appears again and again as a snake biting its own tail. The Ouroboros represents the whole, what has no beginning or end, the eternal and self-sufficient, but it also embodies something deeper. It is the original state of the human psyche before the ego awakened. Erich Neumann, a disciple of Jung, proposed that human consciousness is not born from nothing, but emerges from an archetypal matrix common to all human beings, the collective unconscious. And the Ouroboros is one of its oldest images. Quoting Neumann, the beginning can be located in two places. It can be conceived in humanity's life as the earliest awakening in human history, and in the individual as the earliest awakening in childhood. What Neumann proposes here is something very important for this school of psychology. The history of consciousness is repeated not only in ancient myths, but in each of us. The emergence of consciousness does not occur only once thousands of years ago. It happens every time a child opens their eyes to the world. In other words, the birth of human consciousness echoes in the development of each one of us. This awakening state is projected mythologically on a cosmic scale, appearing as the beginning of the world, as in creation myths. The mythological recounting of the beginning must invariably start with the outer world because the world and the self are still one. There is not yet a self that reflects, that is self-aware, that can refer anything to itself. That is, that sees itself reflected. Not only is the psyche open to the world, it is still identical to the world and not yet differentiated from it. It knows itself as the world and within the world, and experiences its own becoming as a becoming of the world. It experiences its own images as the starry skies, and its own contents as the creator gods of the world. There is no separation between subject and object. The world and the psyche are still one. It is a perfect and round totality. The symbol of the circle, of the egg, of the rotundum, expresses this original state where opposites have not yet divided. As Plato said in the Timaeus, the demiurge creates the world in the shape of a single, self-sufficient sphere capable of providing itself company. And as it is said in the Tao Te Ching, there is something shapeless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth, silent, formless, dependent on nothing, unchanging, ever-expanding, inexhaustible. One could regard it as the mother of all things under heaven. In this state, everything is contained, day and night, birth and death, the self and the world. Even before reflective thought exists, there is the symbol, because the unconscious does not reason. It projects and does not think, but it forms images. And myths are not invention, but memory, the remembrance of that time when soul and universe were one. Thus, the Ouroboros is the image of primordial totality. It is the perfect state where opposites are united. The perfect beginning because the opposites have not yet separated and the world has not yet begun. And the perfect end because the opposites have reunited in a synthesis and the world has come to rest again. It is mother and father, life and death, beginning and end. The one who contains within themselves both the masculine and the feminine is the great hermaphrodite, symbol of the original creative principle, represented in Hindu tradition by the Purusha, who unifies both poles in his own essence. At the beginning of this world, only soul Atman existed in the form of a person. Looking around, he saw nothing but himself. The first thing he said was, "I am." He was, in fact, as vast as a woman and a man tightly embraced. He caused that unity to split in two. From there came a husband, Patty, and a wife, Patney. Neumann says the human unconscious organizes meaning through symbols, not rational ideas. And each symbol is a mirror spinning around the inexplicable, thus revealing different facets of the same center. As a celestial serpent, the Ouroboros was known in ancient Babylon. Later, in the same region, it was often represented by the Mandaru. Its origins were ascribed by Macrobius to the Phoenicians. It is the archetype of Lightopi, the One, who appears under the name of Leviathan and as Aeon, as the ocean, and also as the primordial being who says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." As Neph in antiquity, it is the primordial serpent, the oldest deity of the prehistoric world. The Ouroboros can be traced in the Book of Revelation and among the Gnostics, as well as the Roman syncretists. It also appears in Navajo sand paintings in Egypt, Africa, Mexico, and India, among the Roma as an amulet, and in alchemical texts. Creation myths are, in fact, the story of the awakening of consciousness. The appearance of light as a central theme in all cosmogonies is the symbol of the emerging ego. And consciousness appears as a spark breaking into the dark sea of the unconscious. The symbol that answers the question of origin, where do we come from, is the round. And the round has two faces, the womb and the parents, mother and father, still inseparable. Everything that exists is contained. Everything is held, protected, and enveloped. Everything is one. The world's parents are the symbolic answer to the question of origin, the primordial symbol of eternal life. They are the eternal being that conceives, gives birth, and gives itself birth, that kills and revives. Its unity is a state of transcendent and divine existence, independent of opposites. The incipient Ein Sof of the Kabbalah, which means endless fullness and nothingness. The tremendous power of this primordial symbol of the psyche lies not only in the fact that it contains within itself the undifferentiated union beyond opposites. The Ouroboros also symbolizes the creative impulse of a new beginning. It is the wheel that rolls on its own, the initial circular movement in the ascending spiral of evolution. The organs were signs, not bodies, the unions cosmic acts. The error begins when the transpersonal is reduced to the psychological, the sacred to the profane, the universal to the individual. That misunderstanding, that modern judgment, does not originate in the ancient world, but in the movement that sought to overcome it. Judaism, Christianity, and then Freud placed a heavy moral stone on those living symbols. The unity with the sacred was seen as perversion. But now, when the eyes of the spirit begin to open again to the transpersonal, that error must be reversed. When the ego begins to awaken, it perceives the Ouroboros as a thread, a dark, undifferentiated abyss prior to all form. But in the depths of that darkness also dwells an ancient wisdom, unlearned, unformulated, which meets place before birth or after death. It is a knowledge that is not acquired, but remembered. The Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, teaches that the soul, upon dying, must recognize itself as the great white light, a consciousness without origin or end, inseparable from the luminous body of the Buddha. This same light, says Jewish tradition, burns above the child's head in the womb, revealing to them all the corners of the universe before they forget. To be born, then, is also to forget. And so, the unborn creature, still enveloped in the cycle of the Ouroboros, neither reasons nor learns. It simply is divine, because it participates in the primordial ocean, where not only life is born, but also wisdom. The ocean, always the ocean. Since ancient times, the sea has been a symbol of origin, not only because life was born from it, but because it represents the primordial matrix the deep unconscious. And just as the Ouroboros is serpent and circle, it is also ocean, unfathomable, motionless, and eternal, but also fertile, vibrant, and generative. The primordial ocean, also a symbol of origin, since the Ouroboros, as a circular serpent, is also the ocean, is the source not only of creation but also of wisdom. Hence, the heroes of early cultures often emerge from the sea with half of their bodies in the form of fish, like Oans in Babylon, and provide humanity with their wisdom as revelation. Without time, there is no death. Without time, there is no death. Without separation, there is no desire. Without awareness, there is no wound. Because knowledge is not so much discovery as it is remembrance. Thus understood Plato, when he said that all true knowledge is a recollection of the prenatal. Thus, Hasidism teaches when it speaks of its tzaddik, the righteous one, the one who finds what was lost since birth and returns it to humanity. This is how the peoples live it. When looking at children, do not see ignorance, but living memory. The child is treated with respect, not only for what they will become, but for what they already were. In him, the great symbols are still close. His dreams, his words, his questions carry the echo of ancestral knowledge. It's not something he learned, it's something that belongs to him. Psychology has begun to confirm this from another angle, in terms of patterns. Biology recognizes that in the child resides the inheritance of the lineage, that in their body beats millions of years of history. Jung called that deep and shared knowledge, the repository of ancestral experience. Archetypes constitute people. Not only is it remembered, you are that memory. At the dawn of human consciousness, when the ego is just beginning to form and is still dominated by the unconscious, a fundamental set of symbols related to the body emerges, a body understood as a map of the psyche. This scheme not only organizes the body, but also points to the essence of human experience. The belly is the instinctive and vegetative center, the chest as the realm of feeling and ethics, and the head as the home of spirit and consciousness. In antiquity, instinctive life was charged with mana, a magical force that empowered even the humblest parts of the body, from hair to saliva or breath, all considered creative and sacred. Thus, semen, urine, saliva, even sweat and words were bearers of creative force. Everything that emerged from the body gave life. For primitive man, and even for the child, mental and psychic life gravitated around the belly, the seat of vegetative existence and nourishment. The heart was the center of emotion and ethics, a symbol of decision, as demonstrated by the heavy scale of the Egyptian judgment or the Jewish tradition that values the good heart. Emotions and affections were inseparable from thought in this early stage. Only deep passions could reach consciousness. And beneath the heart, instinctual life dominated, governed by organs such as the liver and kidneys, visceral centers linked to psychic life and sexuality. This primitive body and its visceral psychology reflect a world where survival is sustained by hunger, thirst, and the intake of food, and where the Ouroboros, a symbol of self-feeding, is also the tail eater. In the pregenital phase of human and mythical development, sex as polar tension is still in suspension. The logic of the stronger devouring the weaker prevails. Cannibalism, mutual feeding, and the ingestion of the living symbolize that primordial state. Eating is not just nutrition. It is the very foundation of existence and power, as illustrated by ancient Egyptian texts that describe the resurrected dead as devourers of everything, from gods to men. In Indian tradition, too, hunger and thirst are primordial forces that must be satisfied and that even participate in creation. The Vedic tales depict deities immersed in the primordial waters, while food, conceived as cosmic content, emerges from the meditation of the being upon the waters, thus manifesting life. Eating, devouring, and nourishing are cosmic symbols, but also spiritual actions. Sacrifice, communion, and ritualized ingestion represent the assimilation of power and inner transformation. From food, all creatures are produced, all creatures that inhabit the earth. From food, all creatures are produced, all the creatures that inhabit the earth. For food they live, and in food they finally pass. Food is the principle among beings, therefore they call it the panacea. Truly, he who worships Brahma as food obtains all food. Because food is the principle among beings, therefore they call it the panacea. All creatures are born from food. For food, they continue to grow. The creatures feed on it over creatures. Therefore it is called food. Taittiriya Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad. This food symbolism does not disappear in contemporary language or culture. We talk about being consumed by work or jealousy, or about the jaws of death. Eating and digesting become universal metaphors for the assimilation of experience and knowledge. This ancient food symbolism also appears in the rituals and myths of all cultures. Liquor, bread, water, fruit are vehicles of life, immortality, and sacrifice. In the primitive mind, the psyche is projected into the external world, and what we eat is not just matter, but spiritual essence that we assimilate. The ritual experience of communion or the funeral feast embodies that process of transformation and renewal that is the very foundation of life. Then, the maternal aspect of the Ouroboros is reflected in the attention to the breasts, symbols of nourishment and fertility, like the mother goddess with many breasts or the cow that nurses. The mother nurtures and the child is fertilized through food and excretion, flows that express life without polar tension. But the appearance of the phallic character in the mother announces the differentiation of the subject, the distinction between active and passive, eating and giving birth, the emergence of the ego that begins to separate from the Ouroboros. That beatific state of self-sufficient perfection, where everything flows effortlessly and without suffering in the womb, comes to an end. In that original calm, the ego is a germ that shares the fullness of the unconscious totality, an absolute containment that Plato describes in his myth of the cosmos. She had no need for eyes, as there was nothing outside to be seen, nor for ears, because there was nothing outside her to be heard. There was no surrounding air to breathe, nor did she need any organs to obtain food or dispose of it when it was digested. Nothing came out nor went in anywhere, because there was nothing. By design, it was made this way, its own ways providing its own food, acting completely within and by itself, because its designer considered that a being that was sufficient in itself would be much more excellent than one that depended on anything else. Timaeus, Plato. Throughout this journey, there is a recurring theme that appears as a constant thread, the problem of autarky. It is a central force in human development. Autarky, the primordial self-sufficiency, is intimately linked to the creative impulse, that deep tendency by which the being seeks to engender, define, and sustain itself, without depending on the other. In the symbolic evolution of the human being, we can identify three major phases of this Ouroboros autarky. The first is the pleromatic stage, a paradisiacal state prior to birth, where the ego has not yet emerged and everything is contained in an undifferentiated perfection. It is the life of the unborn, an existence without pain or separation, where consciousness has not yet individualized. In mythical terms, it is the primordial womb, where the embryonic ego floats in wholeness, and where later, from the pain and exile of consciousness, that state will be remembered as a loss. The second phase is that of the nourishing Ouroboros, a symbol of the closed circuit that feeds on itself. Like the ancient symbol of the eat cola, this state represents a circular economy where there is no input or output. Its own waste provides its own food. Here, nutrition does not depend on the external, but on an internal wheel that turns on itself. This stage is also pregenital, prior to sexual polarity, where the nutritious and the excreted are still part of the same undifferentiated flow. The act of feeding oneself is a complete symbol of self-satisfaction, creation, and renewal. The third stage is the genital masturbatory phase, exemplified by the figure of the god Adam from Egyptian mythology, who copulates with his own hand to create the world. Adam, who begets himself, is the archetype of self-fertilization, of the masculine principle that becomes the absolute origin. This autogenesis also appears in Indian myths as tapas, the inner fire of the ascetic, which is ignited by concentration, sacrifice, and the incubation of the creative. Through tapas, the being is spiritually fertilized, not through another, but through an inner intensity. It is a later, more elaborate form of autarky, no longer bodily or nutritional, but spiritual. These three phases, the unborn pleramatic, the nourishing Ouroboros, and the divine masturbatory act, are different faces of the same principle, autonomous creativity. Each one shows a way in which the being seeks to engender without depending, to produce without a bond, to sustain itself from within. And although human consciousness in its development will break away from these closed forms to open itself to the other, to the world, to difference, the nostalgia for that self-sufficiency, the origin without wound, will continue to beat in the depths of the soul. Try to imagine what it was like to be one of the first humans. Reality was experienced without categories as a whole, and man experienced himself only momentarily, like an island that emerges from the sea of the unconscious and soon sinks again. The self is barely a weak, drowsy sprout wrapped in the arms of the world, without will, without direction, just float, just being, like a fish in eternal waters. Nothing is in itself, everything is one. The world protects and nourishes it, while he barely has any actions of his own. And in that state, there is neither effort nor struggle. Consciousness rests in the great nurturing mother that nourishes, shelters, consoles it. The Ouroboros here is also the maternal womb, provides nourishment and pleasure, protects and forgives. It is the refuge for all sufferings, the object of all desires. That initial state of perfect restraint and satisfaction, it is not a historical stage, as Rousseau imagined, but a psychic phase, a liminal image, a psychological paradise to which one never returns, but which dwells forever deep within the human psyche. That living image of the great and good mother has been the refuge of humanity in all times of distress, and always will be, because being contained in the totality, without responsibility, without effort, without division, it is the true Eden. Sometimes that same mother reappears, but only when the self has matured, when it has traversed the world and integrated it. Then the great mother returns, no longer as a womb, but as Sophia, the living wisdom, no longer as a passive shelter, but as active fertility, source of creativity and inner vision. And yet, the primitive man, like the child, does not wake up. Everything in him gravitates towards sleep, towards dilution, towards a specific gravity of the unconscious. Even today, we can see that the desire to remain unconscious, it is not a desire, it is the natural condition of the human being. The unnatural thing is to wake up. One does not wish to be unconscious, one simply is. And only with effort does one conquer their awakening. The ascent to consciousness, says Neumann, is an unnatural act, but deeply human, a struggle between the universally natural and the specifically human. Thus begins the history of consciousness, when, for the first time, something in the man refuses to sleep and decides to open his eyes. As long as the consciousness of the childlike self is weak and feels the effort of its own existence as heavy and oppressive, as long as drowsiness and sleep are perceived as delightful pleasure, it has not yet discovered its own reality and differentiation. As long as this continues, the Ouroboros reigns as the great spinning wheel of life, where everything that is not yet individual is immersed in the union of opposites, dying and desiring to die. While this continues, the Ouroboros reigns as the great rotating wheel of life, where everything that is not yet individual is immersed in the union of opposites, dying and wishing to die. Man has not yet been thrown against himself, against nature, nor the self against the unconscious. Being oneself is still an exhausting and painful experience, still the exception that must be overcome. It is in this sense that we speak of Ouroboros incest. We must clarify that the term incest should be understood symbolically, not concretely or sexually. We must clarify that the term incest should be understood symbolically, not concretely or sexually. Incestuous Ouroboros is a way of entering the mother, of uniting with her, and it stands in stark contrast to other and later forms of incest. Ouroboros incest is a way of entering the mother, of uniting with her, and it stands in stark contrast to other and later forms of incest. In Ouroboros incest, the emphasis on pleasure and love is by no means active. Rather, it is a desire to be dissolved and absorbed. Passively, one allows oneself to be captured, sinks into the pleroma, and disappears into the ocean of pleasure. The great mother retrieves the small child and leads him back into her, and always over the Ouroboros incest rises the insignia of death, which signifies the final dissolution in union with the mother. Cave, earth, tomb, sarcophagus, and coffin constitute symbols of this ritual recombination, which begins with burial in a fetal position in the Stone Age and ends with the modern funeral urns. But the destiny of the human being is not to remain there. The evolution of consciousness begins when the self separates, when it emerges from that cosmic womb and recognizes itself as something distinct from the world. It is a heroic act that involves pain, fear, and loss. To be born to oneself is always heartbreaking, but it is also the beginning of freedom, of creation, of history. The self that is formed begins to build its own center, to organize internal and external objects to form their personality. This task, which lasts a lifetime, is what Neumann calls centripetal development. For the extrovert, the emphasis rests on external objects, people, things, and circumstances. For the introvert, the emphasis rests on internal objects, complexes, and archetypes. Even the development of the introvert, which is mainly related to the psychic background, is in this sense object-bound, despite the fact that the objects are found within them and not outside. Psychic forces rather than social, economic, or physical forces. Even the development of the introvert, which is primarily related to the psychic background, is in this sense object-bound, despite the fact that the objects are found within them and not outside. Psychic forces rather than social, economic, or physical forces. But along with this trend of development, there is another equally legitimate one that is related to itself or self-centered, and that promotes the development of personality and individual fulfillment. But alongside this developmental trend, there is another equally legitimate one, which is self-related or centered, and which promotes the development of personality and individual fulfillment. This development can derive its contents equally from the interior and the exterior, and is nourished by both extroversion and introversion. Its center of gravity, however, does not rest on objects or objective relationships, whether the object in question is internal or external, but on its self-formation. That is, on the construction and shaping of a personality that, as the core of all vital activities, uses all object from the external and internal worlds as building materials for its own totality. This totality is an end in itself, self-sufficient. It is independent of any utility value it may have either for the external collective or for the internal psychic powers. This totality is an end in itself, autarkic. It is independent of any utility value it may have either for the external collective or for the internal psychic powers. Although the Ouroboros represents a primitive stage of consciousness, its autarky, its ability to be self-sufficient, should not be seen as a mistake or a pathology. It is not the same as narcissism, nor as autoeroticism. These terms, used in some psychologies, only make sense when development stagnates, when the self remains immersed in that original matrix for too long. But even then, one must recognize the positive side. The symbol of the Ouroboros, which appeared at the beginning of psychic life, as a total enveloping, as a matrix of unity prior to the ego, does not disappear with development. It re-emerges at the end of the journey, when the life of the ego has completed its cycle, and what is sought is no longer growth towards the world, but reunion with the inner center. In this return, what was once a symbol of the undifferentiated unconscious transforms into the mandala, a circular figure that, like the Ouroboros, encloses, contains, and signifies the sacred. But now it is not a symbol of a passive origin, but of an active integration. while the Ouroboros at the beginning represented the undifferentiated state of the unborn. The one at the end represents a state of achieved fullness. The development of the ego, which was once a struggle to separate, to individualize, gives way to a new movement, that of returning to oneself, but from a different place. When the neurotic was fixation, a refusal to be born, an incestuous attachment to the pleromadic origin, now becomes in the mature man a voluntary release from the world because it has already been lived. The self returns to its source, but not as an evasion, rather as a consummation. This gesture, which is both spiritual and psychological, is represented by the circular figure that reappears time and again in human history. From megalithic sanctuaries to Tibetan mandalas, from the paradise of Genesis to the heavenly Jerusalem of the Apocalypse, the circle with four directions has symbolized both the origin and the end. In Canaanite myths, the great god El sits at the source of the streams, in the midst of the sources of the two seas, right at the center of the world. And from there, the four primordial waters spring forth. This mandala, which is also the transfigured Ouroboros, represents the entirety of the psyche. It is the symbol of a circular, centered, balanced consciousness. At first, it was unconscious fullness. Now it is conquered fullness. It is both the place of transfiguration and the memory of the starting point. The great round of the Ouroboros thus encompasses all existence. It embraces the infant in its undifferentiated origin and receives the elder when they return from the experience of the self. In the mystical experience, this return to the Ouroboros can be lived as a dissolution into the ocean of God. Many times, that implies the surrender of the ego, an ecstasy that borders on death. But when that movement is not a passive regression, but an active transformation, the symbol becomes a matrix of rebirth. It is the profound meaning of stirb und word, die and become. Not an escape, but a creative passage. In this form, the Ouroboros does not imprison, but regenerates. It does not represent the suffocating embrace of the unresolved, but rather the source of new life, of a higher cycle. However, that same figure can have another face. For the neurotic, the one who has not yet fully been born into life, the Ouroboros is not a symbol of wholeness, but a trap. In its embrace, there is no integration, but stagnation. There, it does not appear as a mandala, but as a totalizing mother, as a womb that does not let go. The distinction between the creative process and pathological regression is vital, because both the mystic and the neurotic return to the same symbol. But one passes through it and is reborn. The other remains trapped in its womb.